If I might ask of all of you to find a place to sit or perhaps stand, or perhaps just all scrouch together as you try to find a place. It's delightful to see everybody, and I'm particularly very, very happy to see so many students in our midst. This is the latest and freshest version of the Nanovic Forum, and we're very, very excited about the event. It's very, very special. And I want to begin with just a little bit of history. And I know some of you know about this history and may even have experienced it. On July 1st, 1997, after roughly 150 years of occupation, the United Kingdom transferred power and sovereignty to the Communist government, the People's Republic of China, of Hong Kong. There's no doubt that this was an historic event and continues to be so today for multiple reasons. At that time, there was a diplomat, the governor of Hong Kong, who was rather directly involved in this event, who sent a famous telegram back to London which said, "I have relinquished the administration of this government. God save the Queen." No doubt this was a very distinctive accomplishment, but the greater accomplishment was what had happened in the years right before this date. And that was the fact that this gentleman, the governor of Hong Kong, proved that you could make a commitment to the values and institutions of democracy even against the wishes of the communist government of a country of some 1 billion people. Just before the transfer of power, our guest defied the wishes of this government and reformed the city's legislative council by increasing the number of directly elected seats to the council and thereby broadening direct political participation in this important city at a time of peril for its institutions. Not surprisingly, our guest did not leave China a very popular man. But despite the fact that the government of the People's Republic of China managed to change many of the rules which he fought for and which he introduced, some were preserved, and as a result, the block of votes which stood up to its new government won the single largest number of seats in the next election. This impact stays with us today. For me, it's a testimony to having the courage to really stand up for what you believe in under circumstances in which other people might have been inclined to write off this city's future. And so if you go to Hong Kong today, you can see that it is a distinctive place in part because of the contributions of our guest. Somewhat more recently, when our guest wrote his memoirs, he also won a major victory against an individual, one might say, who at times has a problem with the truth, sometimes like the Chinese government, Rupert Murdoch, who succeeded in persuading HarperCollins publishers not to publish the memoirs. Our guest triumphed in standing up to Mr. Murdoch and ensuring that the memoirs were eventually published. And by the way, these memoirs were somewhat critical of the new government of Hong Kong, as you might imagine. When I look at our guest's achievements, I'm always stunned to see in the record of peoples like him the fact that they have achieved typically more by the age of 30 than I could even conceive of achieving in my entire life. Member of Parliament, Cabinet Minister, Chairman of the Conservative Party, Chairman of the Patten Commission, I'm revealing something about our guest, for Northern Ireland and for the peace process, member of the European Commission for External Affairs of the European Union, currently Chancellor of Oxford and Chairman of the BBC Trust. Our guest tonight will talk about Europe, America, and the changing world order. Lord Patten of Barnes.
Just before I commence, I feel guilty seeing some of you guys standing around against the wall. If you want to come and sit down here without too much embarrassment, you sure? I mean, you can immediately slip out more easily if you want. Okay, I get it. I'm prepared to be embarrassed. Former President's Professor, first of all, can I thank you very much indeed for that extremely kind obituary notice, which my father would have greatly enjoyed and my mother would have believed. It was very kind of you, and I want to thank you all for inviting me to Notre Dame University today. I'm the great-grandson of potato famine Irish immigrants. I guess if they'd gone west rather than east, there's a strong chance that I might have, if I'd been good enough, done an undergraduate program here rather than at Oxford. I was like I guess many of you, the first in my family to go to university, and the first Catholic Chancellor of Oxford University since 1560. I pointed that out to the Pope and noted that the last Catholic Chancellor of Oxford University had been a cardinal, but I got no response. So, tough on me. It's also a great pleasure to be hosted by the Nanovic Institute for European Affairs. All great universities are the products, above all, of countless acts of generosity by benefactors. And I'm delighted the benefactors are with us today. It's a wonderful thing to provide some of the resources to push back the boundaries of scholarship and to enable young men and young women to develop to their full potential. Now, I guess if the European Studies Institute was looking at the situation of Europe today, and perhaps we'll be able to talk about that a bit in questions and answers, they might have difficulty in deciding whether what was happening was good or bad. John Major, the former British Prime Minister, tells a story about a summit meeting with President Yeltsin, and it being the morning, President Yeltsin clearly bore some of the consequences of the night before. And John Major said to President Yeltsin, trying to make polite conversation, what is the present state, he said, of the Russian economy? And President Yeltsin said, good. And John Major said, trying hard, if you had to say slightly more, how would you describe the Russian economy? And President Yeltsin said, not good. And that, I guess, is a pretty good description of where Europe is just at the moment. But more about that just a little bit later. But it's a privilege to come to this great university. I guess that this university, in a way, would share with Oxford University our motto, Dominus Illuminatio Mea. All great universities are foremost bastions of liberty. They're not primarily agents of the economy. They're primarily ways in which young men and young women can help to push back the frontiers of scholarship, as I said just now, and to develop a strong commitment to the sort of values which make our societies more civilized places to live in. So it's a pleasure to be with you at this great university. You may know the story about of Woody Allen announcing to some friends that he'd just done a speed reading course. And he said that he'd just read War and Peace in 20 minutes. It's about Russia, he said. Some of you who have spent a little longer on War and Peace may even have tried to tackle those pretty impenetrable essays during the course of the novel, in which Tolstoy tries to set out his views on the nature of power. He was, of course, obsessed with Napoleon and the French success in rolling back, at least until the arrival of winter, the armies of Russia. In all those essays, he doesn't really dwell very much on what seems to me to have defined power very largely in the last centuries. First of all, sheer scale, sheer size. And secondly, the growth in income per head in those countries. And if you're a large country and income per head is growing, a lot of capita produces an awful lot of growth and an awful lot of economic strength. Europe largely dominated the 19th century. And it was partly because Europe's share of the world population increased from 1/5 to 1/4. That had a lot of consequences for the internal dynamics and security of Europe, helping to produce 3 European civil wars in 70 years from 1870 onwards. But it was also a trigger for the period of European colonialism and expansion around the world. But the Europeans had great difficulty in putting to one side xenophobic nationalism, which led to those wars and which destroyed Europe's power by the middle of the 19th century, by the middle of the 20th century. The 20th century, by common consent, belonged to the United States. The United States, in the second half of the century, helped to put Europe back on its feet and created, more than anyone else, an infrastructure for global order, under which not only others were encouraged to follow the rule book, but unusually the world's only real superpower agreed to follow the rule book itself as well. So we've had a half century or more in which the United States hasn't really been the world's imperium, but far more often the world's emporium, the only country which matters everywhere, with dominance over the global commons: land, sea, air, and space. It's interesting that for much of the period of the United States' dominance, it's been as obsessed with the issue of its own decline. Watergate, Vietnam, the years of stagflation, the years of energy crises. And yet, the world has continued to turn to the United States for leadership. And the United States has deployed economic power and soft power extraordinarily successfully. The world outside can very often get rather annoyed with the United States, and perhaps principally with the way in which the United States so often looks inward. The English novelist Julian Barnes says that if you want to see your own country disappear, you go to America and open an American newspaper. And yet, the rest of the world wants to come to America. You have the greatest universities in the world. You attract to those universities the best and the brightest. And a result is that I am told that this year 75% of the doctorates in science in the United States will be written by foreigners, many of whom stay and start the sort of businesses which have made Silicon Valley such a mecca for entrepreneurial nerds all around the world. So the United States remains dominant despite the humiliations of Wall Street with the Great Crash, and despite the fact that it's very difficult to be the world's only superpower and the world's biggest debtor nation. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been decline as others have grown. I first came to America, first came to the Midwest, when I was a student in the mid-1960s. And then America represented almost 40% of the world's GDP. That figure had fallen to about 30% by the end of the century, and by 2010 it was down to 23%. In 2000, China, the Chinese economy was 1/8 the size of America's. The most recent figures suggest that it's 41% the size of America's. So as others have become more economically successful, so that has had an impact on the amount of muscle power that the United States has in comparison to them, and what it's meant, along with other factors, such as the porousness of national frontiers and the requirements of international cooperation to deal with most of the problems that crowd in on individual nation states. What all that means is that even though America is still stronger than any other country or group of countries, it can't any longer determine the global agenda on its own. It has to work with others in order to deal with the sort of problems which affect all of us, from international economics to the environment to global health to organized crime. The Europeans used to share as junior partners, sometimes as backseat drivers, used to share in global leadership. And Europe has been an extraordinary success story, largely thanks to the encouraged turning away from the sort of xenophobia which produced all that violence from 1870 to 1945. For some in Europe, the issue of the creation of the European Union has been not just economic and not just political, but moral as well. I was thinking when I was shown into your basilica today, through that entrance which is a memorial to those who fought for God and country, of a difference between that memorial and the ones which I see in Oxford and Cambridge colleges. The one, for example, at my wife's late father's college in Cambridge. He was a famous athlete, the Chariots of Fire generation, or just after, ran in the 1936 Olympics and was killed in the Battle of the Falaise Gap shortly after D-Day. What I mean is this, that if you look at the memorial which notes his sacrifice in his college, it records the names of American alumni and Canadian and Australian and Indian and British and German and Italian. You'd find that at my own college in Oxford as well. And my two predecessors as Chancellor of Oxford were respectively Harold Macmillan, who was a British Prime Minister, and Roy Jenkins, who was President of the European Commission. Macmillan had fought in the First World War, and Roy Jenkins fought in the Second. And for them, a reason for their commitment to the European Union was those wars and the obscenities which they thought they represented. Here was a great university, here were great universities in other European countries as well, which brought young men and women together to study Western civilization, to study Aristotle and Plato, to read Thucydides and Xenophon, to read Virgil and Cicero, and then sent them back to their own countries where they learnt to kill one another. So there were moral reasons, as well as political and economic reasons, for the creation of the European Union. It wasn't just a glorified customs union, though it did turn out to be the most successful single market, the most successful example of the establishment of dispute settlement across boundaries. The most practical and effective example of the sharing and therefore the transformation of sovereignty which any group of countries have ever managed to put together. And Europe today, though we in Europe tend to belittle our achievements and write them off, we in Europe today have 7% of the world's population, but almost 30% of the world's output. That's more than the United States, of China, of Japan, of India, and so on. And we're still responsible for 18% of the world's exports. In many respects, we've been less affected in international trade by the rise of China than you have in the United States. Now we face two problems. One of them is the extent to which our rhetoric has run ahead of both economics and of the democratic will of individual nation states. Let me explain, perhaps oversimply, what I mean. President Truman, you know, had on his desk a sign which said, "The buck stops here." And on the other side of the sign, it said, "I'm from Missouri." In Europe, there isn't a buck in the sense of the preparedness to give up control over the most sensitive aspects of economic life, or of security and foreign policy. And there isn't a buck, not because we're from Missouri, but we're from proud, ancient nation states. France, Germany, Britain, Greece. The assumption behind the creation of the Eurozone was that the imbalances between nation states wouldn't matter, just as the imbalance between Rhode Island and New Jersey, or New Hampshire and Utah, doesn't matter. But we in Europe don't have one economic government. And we have to assume in the Eurozone that sooner or later the Greeks will behave like Germans, an inherently implausible proposition, or that the Germans will be happy indefinitely to bail the Greeks out because they're not Germans, another inherently implausible proposition. So the Eurozone is not yet out of the mire and is, as I suggested just now, both a victim of economics and a victim of the consequences of national democratic politics, in which people feel a greater sense of loyalty to the institutions of nation states than to those institutions which are established to manage the sovereignty which their governments are prepared to share. There's one other reason why Europe has to be a little worried just at the moment about how things stand. The European population is likely to fall by mid-century by about 20%. It's already falling in Italy, and the other countries where it is falling most rapidly are Poland and Spain. Poland, Spain, Italy, Just think about that for a moment. The worry for us is that not only is the population falling, but it's aging, and aging quite rapidly. Now, in America, you will be the only rich country in the first half of this century in which the population actually rises, probably by about 100 million. But in Europe, with an aging and falling population, we will have to either increase our underlying growth rate or see a falling share of the world's population mirrored by a falling share of the world's output and a falling share of the world's trade. And very difficult in those circumstances to go on as we are at the moment, 7% of the population, 30% of the world output, punching above our weight. So what can we do to increase our growth rate? I think that the finest political novel about Europe by a European is a book by an Italian called Giuseppe di Lampedusa, called The Leopard, about Italy, about Sicily in the middle of the 19th century. And one of the characters in The Leopard, Tancredi, says famously, things have to change in order to remain the same. And that is a message which Europeans are quite exceptionally reluctant to accept. We think, maybe we're right, maybe we're not, that we have the best quality of life in the world. But we're reluctant to accept that in order to sustain that quality of life, in order to sustain, for example, the entitlement programs in a welfare democracy, we have to make changes. We have, to borrow a Chinese phrase, to smash the iron rice bowl. So that's where China comes in. China and India and the emerging economies, which, as I said a moment or two ago, are large and have per capita GDPs, per capita incomes, which are themselves now growing quickly. The emerging economies used to be called until the 1970s the Third World. And the Third World was a phrase which conjured up visions of polyester shirts, of Soviet-era tractors, of corruption, and of poverty. The International Financial Corporation of the World Bank dreamt up a different phrase in the 1970s, 1980s, emerging markets. The emerging markets have been emerging with remarkable speed, partly, of course, because of the consequences of compound growth. You grow at 10% a year. You don't have to be a very profound mathematician to know that that doesn't mean that you double the size of your economy in 10 years, but in 7. Last year, the emerging markets attracted $1 trillion of investment from the old, richer world and represent 30% of GDP now. In a lot of ways, that's simply turning the clock back. Until the beginning of the 19th century, China and India, for example, represented 50% of the world's total wealth. China about 33%, India 16 or 17%. But riches per head had been declining in relation to Europe since about 1500. And the Industrial Revolution in Europe and in America catapulted the Europeans and Americans ahead of the Asians. In the 1970s and 80s, perhaps 90s as well if you include India, Asia rejoined the global economy and made its peace with capitalism. And the results have been astonishing. The results have been a transformation in the balance between the Western economies and the Asian. India, for example. India has begun creating its own middle class. It's established a number of gold standard multinational corporations, Tata, Infosys, Reliance, Ranbaxy. It's a hugely effective competitor in areas like pharmaceuticals, back office, outsourcing, car manufacture, doing extraordinarily well, run by the most economically literate team probably in the world. But before one allows Goldman Sachs to encourage us to think that lines simply move inexorably up the graph paper, it's worth also noticing that India has huge weaknesses as well. Terrible infrastructure, appalling levels of corruption, the criminalization of part of the political system, a lack of confidence in the institutions of representative government, 3 chief justices in Indian states now helping the constabulary with their inquiries, huge degrees of social inequity, triggering a Naxalite Maoist insurrection in a great swathe of central and eastern India. So India remains an exciting country, I think probably the most interesting country in the world. But I don't believe that India is going to be a superpower, even if it's going to be the most interesting country to observe. I first went to China, or first saw China, in 1979. China in 1979 exported in the whole year the same amount that China exports now in a day. China made in the 1970s in a year what China makes these days in a fortnight. China is the largest manufacturer in the world, the largest exporter, the largest consumer of energy, the largest steel maker, and makes more sombreros than Mexico. And the gee whiz statistics roll on. Thanks to China's embrace of globalization, Chinese governments have lifted probably 400 million people out of absolute poverty. But China too offers challenges to the Goldman Sachs economists who simply believe in inevitable exponentialism. China has 4 problems which confront it. First of all, it has a problem of reshaping its economy from one which is largely based on manufacturing industry and the export of goods more cheaply than the West can make them, to an economy in which there is more domestic consumption and investment. It's a matter of some interest that in the period of stellar economic growth from 1997 to 2007, the share of the Chinese economy taken in pay fell from 53% to 40%. It's an extraordinary definition of communism when you think about it. The money was going into the foreign exchange war chest, lent so that America could live beyond its means. Half the growth from 2001 to 2007, it's worth recalling, came from the American deficit and Chinese exports. It's also seen huge increases in corporate profits and private wealth, many of those corporate profits allocated or misallocated to economic projects which make very little sense. So China has a problem of reorganizing its economy. It secondly faces huge environmental problems, with about half of the most polluted cities in the world in China. It has big problems of social inequity, with the Gini coefficient, which sounds like an Irish friend. The Gini coefficient showing alarming and growing gap between the very rich and the rest of the community. And that has a political dimension as well, because as the Prime Minister Wen Jiabao has pointed out, there is also a growing problem of trust on the part of ordinary Chinese in their government in what it says about health standards or environmental standards or other matters as well. You'll recall the controversy about 18 months ago after a serious train crash. But there's a fourth issue which it seems to me we've been reminded about by the Bo Xilai case, which is at present playing out in front of our eyes. The velvet curtain twitched, and what we saw, which shouldn't surprise us, is there is a real political argument going on inside the Chinese leadership compound, just as there is in the leadership of every other great country or society around the world. And the argument, which has perhaps been given a particular vigor or embellishment in the case of Bo Xilai, the argument really goes like this, and it's an existential one. One group of, on the whole, party hardliners and conservatives say to the reformers, the party can't continue to give up control over the economy without risking losing control over the state. You can't go on privatizing state-owned enterprises where the productivity levels are so much lower than they are in the private sector. You can't go on allowing the private sector to come in and run things rather than them being run by state-owned enterprises. You can't do that without sooner or later the party losing its control over the institutions of the state. The modernizers, who in this case include the bankers, this is a country where we should all be cheering the bankers rather than calling for the guillotine. The modernizers say, but unless the party gives up control over larger chunks of the economy, we won't grow so fast, we won't create as many jobs, and in those circumstances, the party will certainly lose control over the state. And the great dilemma which the Chinese leadership faces is both those positions, both those propositions are entirely true. That is the dilemma which I think the fifth generation of leaders this year have to face. And it's in all our interest that they should manage to find a way through that dilemma, which doesn't plunge China into chaos. Because China doing well is not a threat to the rest of the world. China doing badly would be a threat to the rest of the world and would be a serious threat to our quality of life and to our stability. So here you have a superpower which is also the world's biggest debtor, which frankly doesn't really want the rest of the world to make too much of a fuss. You have Europe, which has rather lost its way. You have India and China and Brazil and others. I haven't included Russia because I rather agree with Nouriel Rabini that Russia is more sick than brick. You have these other growing economies which are strong enough now to mean that America and Europe can't simply get their way if they knew what that way was. And all of us challenged because we have to cooperate more together to deal with international and national problems at precisely the time when the credibility of the institutions that we created 60, 70 years ago to manage that cooperation has declined as much as it has. So I guess we'll muddle through. The former master of Trinity College at Cambridge, the former Astronomer Royal, a great astrophysicist, wrote a book 3 or 4 years ago in which he called in the first draft the final century ? His publishers persuaded him to take out the question mark. The book sold very well in Britain and was sold to an American publisher who reissued it under the title The Final Hour. Now, I'm not as gloomy about the future as Lord Rees was, but I certainly think it's less predictable than it's been at any time in my political lifetime, which is, I guess, an argument for us hanging on to the values which we know are important, values which are universal, a belief in accountability, a belief in strong civil society, a belief in freedom of speech and freedom of association and freedom of worship, a belief in clean government and the rule of law and due process. And if we can be more effective and coherent about making those things work in our own societies, maybe we'll carry more conviction when we argue that other people should run their affairs like that as well. It's not a very dramatic suggestion to make about how the future might be a bit better, but I can't think of any other, and look increasingly at my grandchildren and wonder what things are going to look like for them when they're my age, provided they get to be my age. Any questions?
Yes, we'd be delighted to take some questions. The Nanovic rule and custom is we always begin with students. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, this is a student who's moving, who's a Chinese national, who's been here since he was 6. Correct me if I get any of this wrong. Who's going to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Is that the Hong Kong U or the Chinese University in Hong Kong next year? And he wants to know what I think will be the future relationship between the mainland government in China and the government in Hong Kong. The greatest protection for liberties in Hong Kong is the fact that in Hong Kong there is such a strong sense of citizenship, a stronger sense of citizenship than I think exists in almost any other Asian country. So in Hong Kong, which is part of China, in Hong Kong there's all the software and hardware of a plural liberal society, except the ability to elect its own government. There's a good and clean civil service, police, strong churches, freedom of speech, freedom of association, rule of law, a very strong Chief Justice just retired who has protected the judiciary. They have all those things, but they can't elect their own government. Well, they will sooner or later. The Chinese government have promised them that they can elect their chief executive the next time round. But I'll tell you what happened this time round. There was the election was to take place with, I think, 1,200 hand-picked members of an election committee. There was a candidate apparently strongly favored by the Chinese government who got into all sorts of hot water, which was exposed rather brutally by Hong Kong's free press. It pointed out that he had been, how can I put this charitably? He had been adding enthusiastically to the world's population. It pointed out that he had, without getting planning permission, built wine cellars for his spectacular collection of first growth clarets under his house, which were, I think, 4 times the size of the average home in Hong Kong. The press, as you can imagine, had a field day with that. You know what they do in elections in any free society. So the guy who had been originally favored by China suddenly finds himself 25% behind in the opinion polls. And there are people saying to Beijing, if you simply insist that this hand-picked election committee chooses a guy who's 25%, maybe 30% behind in the opinion polls, there are going to be tens of thousands of people on the streets in Hong Kong protesting about it. So smartly, they backed another candidate. Now, the other candidate hasn't had hugely impressive democratic credentials in the past, but he does appear to understand some of the social issues that so concern people in Hong Kong. And for me, it was just an indication of how Hong Kong, despite the fact that it doesn't elect its own government yet, is able to flex its muscles from time to time. I think that by and large, China has kept its word on Hong Kong, and that Hong Kong, if you were a Chinese leader today, Hong Kong would not feature in the first 50 problems in your in-tray. Look, Hong Kong works. Why should any Chinese leader or Chinese government want to interfere with something which is working pretty well? Will China offer a path for, will Hong Kong offer China a path for political and economic reform in the future? I don't know. But certainly Hong Kong and Taiwan are very good examples of how much nonsense is talked about Confucian societies being hostile to democracy. Everyone at a certain educational point wants to determine their own affairs, wants to determine not only where their money should be invested or whether it should be put under the mattress, but also how their kids are going to be educated, how their rubbish is going to be dealt with, and how their health service is going to be run. That's why democracy, for all its imperfections, remains the system of government which most people choose, whatever their ethnicity or religion.
Yes.
You were talking earlier about population decline in Europe. Will China eventually start to have that problem too? And with a lot of countries living with a smaller population?
Yeah. Okay. Will China be affected as well by population change? I wish, if I had my time over again, I think I'd have studied demography. We can't predict many things, but demography is increasingly easier to predict. And if you look at fertility rates and longevity and the triumph of biomedicine, which I guess is going to be the queen of sciences in the next few years, then some things become pretty clear. One thing which is clear is that the Indian population will outstrip China's by about 2040, certainly 2050. And at the same time, the Indian population will be a lot younger than China's. At present, this is Michael Caine is said to have said, not a lot of people know that before giving you statistics which sort of sensible people boggle at. But the Indian working population is at present 77% of China's, and by 2040, 2050, the Indian working population will be 140% the size of China's, because China's population is aging just as it's slightly declining. So by 2050, 2060, India will be about 1.7 billion. China's still about where it is today, but the second largest population after India's will be Chinese pensioners. That has huge implications. It has huge implications for the way you manage an economy, and it has huge implications for economic development. that issue of longevity and the aging of populations has, of course, implications for all of us in developed countries as well. We hear politicians arguing the toss about the importance of reducing the size of government. In all our democracies, government is going to increase as a proportion of GDP in the next few years because of aging, because of the costs of older people in terms of pensions and healthcare. And most of the serious statistics suggest that those costs will put about 10% on the proportion of government programs in most countries' GDPs, you know. But China will face that issue of having to cope, having to run an economy with a smaller workforce. India will have to face the challenge of finding jobs for a lot of young Indians, and they're both likely to be the sort of issues that will shape their destinies and ours as well. So, amateur demography.
I've recently read Sebastian Rosado's piece, Europe's Troubles, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are for how long you think the European Union is going to last.
I think the political commitment to the European Union is will ensure that most of the European Union lasts, certainly the single market, single environment policy, single trade policy. I think the most likely outcome for the Eurozone is a two-stage Eurozone, or an inner Eurozone and an outer Eurozone, perhaps with a common currency in some countries, the euro running alongside local currencies, and a single currency in stronger economies. But Europe, the European Union, will continue to exist, though there's a big, I think, existential question about whether we are prepared, provided Turkey completes the reforms to which it's set its hand, whether we'll, in due course, accept Turkey as members. I think that's a key issue, both for our economic development and for our geostrategic position, and for our cultural position as well.
So to clarify, you think it's going to continue growing together?
No, I think it's going to continue, but I think it's probably reached the limits of how much national democracies are prepared to hand over to a central institution. Let me give you an example. At what point in time are the French going to be happy about the German Parliament establishing their tax rates or public spending levels? Seems to me that this is unlikely to happen very soon.
Now, I know we have a lot of questions here, but I want to continue with students at this point. So you, and then you, and then you. Oh, and then here, and then you. Okay, so precise questions, but we do have the time. And we'll try to
Precise questions, which I can then avoid at length.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what is your current relationship, if any, with Hong Kong?
I'm an occasional visitor. I took my whole family, all 16 of us, to Hong Kong for Christmas, and we had a whale of a time. And if you read the BA Premier Club magazine next time you're on a plane, you'll read an account of it. My relationship with China has been transformed. The Chinese are very realistic. Within about 18 months of my departure from Hong Kong as a sinner condemned for 1,000 generations, to borrow a phrase, I was welcomed back into the fold. I remember the the Chinese foreign minister telling me that my position had been considered by the leadership. I was by that stage responsible for Europe's relations with China, so maybe that had something to do with it, and that they regarded me as a force of concord rather than discord. It was the same Chinese minister who came into my office and looked at the photographs on my wall of my daughters, and he said to me, "Are those your daughters?" And I said, "Yes, they were." And he said, "How is it," he said, "that such beautiful daughters have such an ugly father?" It's called diplomacy.
Was our next question here? Yeah.
So you're saying that success in China is not a threat to the world. However, being a socialist state, the success of China is a threat to the democracy in the world?
I don't know what Chinese socialism means. If Bo Xilai is an example of Chinese socialism, then it's a rum political philosophy. The last time, we have a very expensive, very good independent school in England called Eton. Have you ever heard of Eton? The last time I went there, I was asked if I would go to a reception for the new Mandarin teacher. I said, fine. So after my talk, I went to the reception. I assumed the Mandarin teacher was there to teach young British boys Mandarin, not a bit of it. He was there to keep up the Mandarin of the mainland Chinese students at Eton, who in a socialist country were able, 40 of them, to pay the fees of Eton. So it's a rum sort of socialism which has allowed the gap between the rich and poor to open as much as it has. Now, I've spoken 3 times at the at the party school in Beijing and the one whose name I forget exactly in Shanghai, and I was surprised by the openness of the questions I got about social inequity issues in China and how to try to make economic growth socially inclusive. I mean, it's a problem for all of us. It's a problem in the United States. It's a problem in Europe. But it's sure as anything a problem in socialist China. So I don't think China is socialist. I think it's Leninist, which is different.
Yes.
The church is at present, the Catholic Church is at present responsible for about 25% of the education provision and about 25% of the healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa. And I guess there are similarly impressive statistics for poorer countries in Latin America. The figures wouldn't be quite the same in Asia, but they would be significant. And I think that's an example of the Church's mission in action. I don't know how some politicians can say that religion has nothing to do with politics. I don't think there is one way in which, because you're a Christian, you should vote. But it seems to me that the whole of the Christian message is on the side of the poor and on the side of the downtrodden. and on the side of the abused, which is why in my country and in others, I think the abuse of children has been such a terrible and wounding issue for the church. But I have no problem at all about church leaders speaking on political issues. No, I'll leave it at that.
Yes.
Hi, I am currently taking a class continuing in China, and some of our classmates and our professors, Professor Hui, are also here today. So we learned from the class what you mentioned earlier, that there are party hardliners and reformers who are facing a huge dilemma during the Chinese government. But we learned that the problem is that Chinese government does not have enough freedom of speech, and there are a huge number of corrupted government officials. And you mentioned that you believe in freedom of speech and you believe in clean government. So my question is, do you really believe that the Chinese government, with a huge number of corrupted officials and not enough freedom of speech, can really solve this dilemma, and that China doing economically well is not a threat to the world?
Well, discuss. Let me say two things in response. First of all, corruption isn't simply a Chinese or Asian phenomenon. Corruption is an unfair tax, principally on the poor, in every society. We face corruption in my own country. Corruption can be a problem in the United States, and it's certainly a problem in China and Asia in general. And what makes it more of a problem is that there isn't a system of accountability which it exposes it so that it's easier to get away with, so there is more of it. Wen Jiabao has said that in order to run a sustainable, sophisticated economy, you need greater accountability and greater openness. And I think that is absolutely true. A second point is this. We shouldn't be surprised that there's an argument within the Chinese leadership between different factions and groups. The surprise would be if there was the consensus which Chinese leaders often claim exists. Let me offer you a metaphor, an analogy. I'm not a sailor. When I go to the seaside and there's a regatta, I see yachts bowling around the bay. I have no idea whether the race has just started or is about to finish, or who's winning or who's coming last. All I know is there's a race going on. And in every political system, there's a race and an argument going on. That's what politics is largely about. I think what's surprising about the Bo Xilai case is that he plainly challenged the notion that the world should see everything in China being determined by a consensus, and tried to elbow his way into the leadership rather than emerge. But one final thought for you. We're told that the next president of China is going to be Mr. Xi Jinping. Mr. Xi Jinping will probably have more impact on your and my life than President Obama or Governor Romney. What does any of us know about Xi Jinping? What does he believe? What does he think? Which way does he want to take China and the Chinese economy? What does he think about nuclear weapons in Iran? What does he think about international trade talks? None of us know. Sooner or later, I guess we will know more about Chinese leaders because the Chinese people, above all, will insist that we do.
I'm going to start collecting all questions here to the extent that I can, starting with Professor Walsh.
A couple of brief comments and a question. There are amount of evidence that it's very difficult to sustain democratic institutions when the gap between the rich and poor is widening dramatically and persistently. Second comment, Canada is a long place with its population spread across the northern American border, and it's not quite clear how it maintains its citizenship. It may be that it's a national health program, and so people take care of each other. Now, you made the comment that Europe might have lost its way, perhaps buffeted by the free market, and obviously the fact that it hasn't got a decent central bank. But couldn't it also be a problem of Europe pioneering for the world social security systems that can create human beings that are confident about their basic needs being met?
Yeah, I have some sympathy with that point. I think that our welfare democracy has, over time, attenuated people's understanding about what you need to do in order to afford that system of welfare provision. I do think that there is a real challenge for politicians, for political leaders, in getting that across. And they're not proving very good at it at the moment, partly because they're not trying. My least favorite example of European leadership came from the chairman of the Eurogroup finance ministers, who's the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Mr. Jean-Paul Juncker. Mr. Juncker was asked after a European Council meeting not very long ago why Europe didn't implement reforms to make it more competitive. Didn't they know what they needed to do? And he said, no, we know what we have to do. We just don't know how we'd get re-elected if we did it. Which is, I guess, the sort of political leadership of the 21st century which we could do without. On your first point, I'm very suspicious of attempts to link, as though with an umbilical cord, levels of economic attainment and democratic aspiration. So, for example, while I think Freedom House are terrific, some of the attempts to draw a precise linkage between levels of per capita income and democracy are a bit suspect. And I think anyway that democracy is about more than simply voting. But I think that a growing gap between rich and poor could be both a trigger for greater democracy, as well as you suggested, a reason why people wanted to focus on things other than democracy. Social inequity has invariably been an issue used by the left in politics to promote greater public accountability. And it's one of the curiosities of modern European politics, and perhaps politics in America, that growing inequity and the appalling behavior of some people in the run-up to and in the wake of the financial crash, when we discovered that gains were to be privatized and losses socialized, it's a surprise to me that the traditional left haven't made much more successfully an argument out of all that. The person who made the arguments best, in my view, a now, alas, dead historian and public intellectual, was Tony Judt, a British left-wing intellectual who'd made his academic life in America and wrote a book called Ill Fares the Land, which is a brilliant assassination of some of the centre-right orthodoxies of the last few years and the behaviour of some capitalist barons. But it's a curiosity, I think, that the left have behaved so incompetently in dealing with those issues, and that, I think, is partly because they had their snouts in the trough as well.
We have time for two more.
Using the wrong party.
No, I mean, I'm an old-fashioned Tory.
We actually have time for only one more question, so here and quickly.
Thank you very much for a presentation which has drawn large historical trend lines. I wonder whether you think the current economic crisis in Europe is presaging or part of a large historical trend, or whether it's just a bump in the historical road. The levels of unemployment in Spain, for example, especially among the young, are frightening. As against the teaching of Keynesian economics that you need to prime the pump to get the economy going again, you have fiscal restraint. And on the other hand, if you were to spend large sums of money to get the economy going, you'd have to face the deficit problem. Is this something that really is going to shape Europe's economic future and possibly its political future for decades to come?
I hope not. What is happening in Spain and some other countries is a consequence of the fact that those countries are part of a currency union, which is not also a fiscal union, and which is never going to be in the full sense of the word. How would Spain, first of all, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, are partly in the mess they're in because they were able, with the introduction of the euro, to borrow so much money at knockdown prices because of the security provided by the euro. And because in those circumstances so much money flowed in from Northern Europe into things like the construction boom in Spain. Now, historically, a country like Spain would in the short term get out of its present mess by devaluing and by inflation. That's not heroic. And it's not a way in the long term in which you improve your competitiveness. And then you would have hoped that steadily over a period of time, Spain would have reformed its labour market, which it needs to do, that it would have got a grip on the long-term profligate spending by regional authorities and so on and so on. But at present, what it has to do within the euro is to slash and burn, to cut public spending, even when that public spending is under the control of provincial authorities like education and health, and even though that austerity program is going to increase, not decrease, levels of unemployment. So it's not the sort of economics of which the late Lord Keynes would have been in favour. Are we faced with a long-term trend or some painful short-term blips, I don't see any reason why Europe's inherent advantages should be completely destroyed in the next few years. It is, after all, more difficult, to become poor when you're rich. Some countries manage it. Argentina managed it with great aplomb. But on the whole, once you're rich, you should be able to hang on to your money or the reasons why you're rich. So I think Europe should be okay, but it will have to change policies in order to, as I said earlier, make itself a bit more competitive. If you have labour laws, to think through the position in Spain again, if you have labour laws which make it pretty well impossible for an employer to sack anybody, a consequence is that a lot of employers won't employ anybody except on short-term contracts. So there are swings and roundabouts in all this. But the situation certainly doesn't look very encouraging at the moment, though we continue, as I said, to outperform most others in the exports that we produce. I hope we'll find a way in which we can reconcile what is politically possible with what is economically desirable. Yet another government is about to fall in France, I guess, as a result of the Eurozone crisis. That means Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, France next, Ireland, and if the governments that were elected to replace the ones which were in office when the Eurozone crisis hit, themselves in 2 or 3 years are getting thrown out of office, then you really get a difficult story.
Lord Patten, I want to thank you.